Okay, this is the State Coastal Conservancy, and we are starting our webinar on our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Guidelines. I'm very hopeful that everyone can see the screen and can actually hear me. And just so you know who is on our end, this is Amy Hutzel at the State Coastal Conservancy. I'm joined by Linda Tong and Taylor Samuelson, also with the State Coastal Conservancy, and the three of us are taking turns presenting on our draft guidelines. In terms of logistics, you can enter questions or comments, and at the end of this webinar, we will spend time responding to the questions that are entered. The draft Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Guidelines and the associated materials like the memo to our board and the summary of our survey and focus group sessions, as well as the appendix describing actions we are taking or plan to take, are all available on our website. We will be summarizing those, but we encourage you to look at the documents. The actual draft JEDI guidelines are fairly short. I believe it's 2 pages plus the definitions and the appendices, and that's at scc.ca.gov, and then you go to the About tab, and you go to the Equity and Environmental Justice button on the About tab. And we are recording this webinar, and we will post it on that site as well. So if you want to watch it again, you can. But we encourage you to share with others. And yeah, we have about 51 attendees at this point, and we are going to dive in. Okay. Sorry, technical issues. So why and how we developed these Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Guidelines. So many state agencies in California have been working to understand their role in perpetuating inequity and exclusion, and working to identify ways to address these injustices. The Coastal Conservancy, we are a relatively small agency, about 65 staff people total. We're a non-regulatory agency. We work on the coast of California, in coastal watersheds, in the 9-county Bay Area, and in the Santa Ana River watershed. And we provide grants and develop and implement projects to protect and restore coastal lands and watersheds, to increase public access to the coast, to enhance people's experience accessing and enjoying the coast, and to address climate change impacts on the coast of California to communities and to natural resources, and specifically focused on sea level rise. We have had an internal Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion committee on staff for the past 2.5 or 3 years, and have been taking a number of actions to change how we do our work through that committee. And we'll talk more about those at the end of this webinar. These JEDI guidelines are intended to be a public-facing document that's adopted by our board, and that has our board's backing, and that will serve as an umbrella for all of our JEDI work. So I just want to make sure it's clear, the JEDI guidelines are not the only aspect of this work we're doing. They're intended to be relatively brief and serve as a broad guiding document for us. So in 2018, the Conservancy sent a cohort of 15 members of our staff through the Government Alliance on Race and Equity training, GARE. And that included all the members of our senior management, both of our human resources staff, and many of our project managers. So through this year-long training, we were able to better understand how the California coast has been a place of exclusion and discrimination over time, and injustices. And I think many of us learned a great deal through that year, and really want to thank GARE for that experience. We are participating again in GARE this year. So during that GARE training in 2018, we were assigned to research exclusionary practices or injustices within our jurisdiction. Each agency participating in GARE was assigned to do that. And we learned of the story of Bruce's Beach, and it's not really my story to tell, so I'm not going to go into detail on the story of Bruce's Beach, but it's just a really stark example of the history of discrimination and exclusionary practices on the California coast. And if you want to learn more, I encourage you to read a new book out. Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson just published Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era. So now on to how we went about developing these guidelines. We started work on the guidelines in early 2019, and our first step was to conduct an online survey. And we distributed that as widely as we possibly could, and had the help of some other state agencies in distributing it. We got 330 respondents. And a wealth of information, and I really want to thank everybody who took that online survey. One comment that came in was, read the existing resources that outline key opportunities to increase equity. Don't reinvent the wheel. So we took that to heart. We spent a lot of time reading the comments and feedback that the State Lands Commission and Coastal Commission received during their environmental justice guideline development processes, and more recently have reviewed the work of the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, as well as reports put out by Greenlining Institute and APEN. So we really want to thank all these agencies and organizations for this information that's helping us in our work. We then drafted a straw person set of guidelines to use as a starting point in discussions, and we conducted focus groups to workshop these straw person guidelines. And when I say we conducted, we actually worked with others to conduct the focus groups. And I really want to thank the facilitators and organizers of the focus groups, as well as the 40 participants who took part in these 5 focus groups. So in Sacramento, Jose Gonzalez led a focus group focused on the Parks Forward work, or the Parks Now work. Actually, probably should not have put Parks Forward, probably Parks Now. And then Nahalgo Guy led a focus group in the Bay Area. That was a kind of a geographic focus group. Better World Group led a focus group in Los Angeles, Estelano Advisors in San Diego, and Mary Rose Taruk led a focus group of environmental justice leaders statewide. We also separately conducted tribal outreach. We had considered conducting a tribal focus group, but just it seemed challenging for tribal representatives to have to come from all across our jurisdiction to attend one focus group. So we did individualized outreach to tribes, and that work is continuing. We have had several one-on-one meetings with tribal representatives to talk about both these guidelines as well as our the work we could be doing to support tribes. And right now we're in the public comment period for our draft focus group. So we took all of this input through the online survey, through the research we did, from the focus groups. We revised the straw person, put together the draft justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion guidelines, and are accepting public comments now. We will have a workshop at our February board meeting, and Taylor will be talking more about that at the end of this webinar. And what we hope to get to is adoption by the Conservancy board of our guidelines. So some of the major themes that we heard from the survey and focus groups, and this is just a word cloud from the online survey. I'll be going through these major themes, and then Linda's going to talk about the actual content of the JEDI guidelines in response to those themes. So first, hearing about the relevancy of the State Coastal Conservancy. And for these slides, I'm just going to share quotes from the focus groups and the online surveys on these different topics. And obviously, from the online survey and the focus groups, there are many other themes that and many other comments that came through too. So this is our attempt to summarize some of the major themes. So relevancy of our agency. Our name sounds limiting because watersheds are more accessible, and the Bay really charging us to redefine what coastal means. Changing the model of what's the right way to access nature, figuring out the kinds of facilities people want to see, and whether those facilities cater to the kinds of things communities of color would like to do. And on outreach, it's notable that many of us haven't heard of the State Coastal Conservancy and the funding. It would be beneficial to look at funding groups who aren't overtly environmental groups. Look into community and cultural groups. Another theme was around investing in community engagement and community-based organizations. This came up quite a bit. Some of the quotes include invest in community organizations who have a track record of working with communities of color to implement projects. Comprehensive community engagement involves being intentional about engaging community residents and really understanding their issues. Government agencies are seen as not prioritizing the time, energy, and skill that community organizations invest in building trust with their communities. And the true cost of community engagement is far from being adequately recognized. Funds need to recognize the lack of trust between communities and agencies, and the fact that much time and energy needs to go into restorative justice, mediation, and if needed, development of partnership agreements or partnering agreements. Another theme was around the equity of our grants programs. And again, that's a significant part of the work we do at the State Coastal Conservancy is managing grant programs and distributing funds. So there was a call to collect and analyze data on the types of organizations, geographies, and programs where we have made investments to identify the gaps. One small nonprofit stressed that the Conservancy should acknowledge everyone's needs may not be the same and provide individualized technical assistance and more flexible guidelines. Organizations and communities are wary of equity funding going to bigger organizations and perpetuating inequitable funding practices. This kind of relates to the community engagement work as well. Really, as an agency, making sure our funding is going directly to the smaller community-based organizations and supporting their work and recognizing that their work is extremely valuable and takes time and energy. And then modifying our grant program guidelines to support and prioritize efforts to reduce environmental burden in overburdened communities. So, what are we funding? What are we prioritizing? And are we actually getting at projects that will serve frontline communities? And then there were comments around representation. So elevate and normalize Indigenous people and other people of color to be the face of coastal stories instead of white Conservancy staff or other environmentalists as the experts. The benefits of having a diverse staff was recognized, but stressed that diversity alone does not guarantee inclusion. And then really getting at our internal work. If the Conservancy is to truly embark upon this work, its internal staff and culture needs to be one of equity, diverse, respect, and compassion. And if you cannot achieve this internally, how can you hope to change the state at large? So that's a very good question. And then many comments around accountability. So, we can say all this great stuff, but how are we actually going to be held accountable by the people we serve in California? So some of the quotes around that: everyone involved with this work should undergo an equity and diversity workshop so they truly understand what it means to carry out equitable work, not just pat yourself on the back superficial work. Participants, and those are the participants from the focus groups, we'll be looking to see what comes of this. What is the follow-up, and ultimately how this changes practices that reach back to the communities they work with. There's an excitement that equity is now more common of a term, but there is still concern that its meaningful and impactful action is lost in trendiness that will not result in actual outcomes. So now I'm going to turn it over to Linda.
Thanks, Amy. I want to now introduce a summary of the content of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Guidelines draft, which has been shaped by the focus group feedback and all of the previous work that's been done by other agencies and organizations that Amy has said that we've referenced. And of course, these draft guidelines will be further improved by comments during this public comment period. Our draft JEDI guidelines begins with an introduction that acknowledges the exclusion, displacement, injustice, and extractive practices that have occurred and still occur along the California coast. But the State Coastal Conservancy is committing to addressing some of these injustices and trying to move forward in an equitable and inclusive manner. The guideline also goes into some background on Conservancy programs, such as the Explore the Coast program, which provides coastal experiences for youth and adults that may face challenges getting to or enjoying the coast, and our Climate Ready program, which increases social and ecological resilience to climate change. And we state in our guidelines that these programs can be used to promote equitable outcomes. Our JEDI guidelines are split up into 6 main topics. The first one is partnerships that we can foster to increase equity outcomes, how we can make our grant programs more equitable, increasing meaningful community engagement, working with California's tribes, increasing Coastal Conservancy staff, understanding and commitment to equity, and how we can be accountable and transparent in this process. So the first topic in our JEDI guidelines is partnerships, and this is just a summary of what is in our guidelines document. We want to build relationships with community-based organizations and support people and organizations that are advocating for equity and environmental justice. And we want to provide assistance to community-based organizations when they're applying for Conservancy grants, and as well as managing Conservancy grants once they've received our funding. Our second topic in our guidelines is funding programs, and this is a summary of some of the points that we have under that section. The Conservancy should be funding projects that increase equity and justice, such as prioritizing projects that benefit frontline communities. In addition to funding projects that benefit these communities, we also want to co-develop grant programs with input from such communities, and we have some examples of current actions that we're taking on that front. And we also want to include funding for jobs and workforce development within grants. And a final point under that section is reducing barriers to accessing and spending Conservancy grant money and remaining flexible. Our third topic in our guidelines is meaningful community engagement. And this section includes points such as engaging with communities with cultural humility and building trust. We also want to meet communities where they are, both physically and in terms of their priorities. And we should be ensuring communities have decision-making roles in developing Conservancy projects. And we want to recognize the value of community expertise. So funds go to community-based organizations to lead the community engagement that we want to see. The fourth topic in our JEDI guidelines is working with California's tribes. Some points are doing early consultation with tribes and respecting any of their concerns, seeking solutions to state contracting issues that might affect the sovereignty of tribes, assisting tribes to regain access to ancestral lands through land conservation and public access programs, working with tribes to co-manage ancestral lands, and ensuring programs include Indigenous voices and leadership, including traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous stewardship. So those first four topics in our JEDI guidelines talk about the Conservancy's relationship with other organizations and agencies, and this fifth topic is more about the internal work that we need to do to accomplish those external goals. So this topic is the Coastal Conservancy staff and board. And we want to strive for a diverse and inclusive workforce across the depth and breadth of the agency. We want to support efforts for the board to reflect California's diversity to the extent possible. And we want to articulate our justice and equity values explicitly in our strategic plan, which is updated every 5 years. We also want to conduct continue conducting workshops for staff so that we can continue learning about how to best approach this work. And we want to ensure that staff prioritize this work and are supported by management. And our last topic in our JEDI guidelines is on accountability and transparency. We want to include metrics for equity and environmental justice objectives in our strategic plan. We currently have 3 of these objectives in our strategic plan, but in the next round, in our update of our strategic plan, we'll hopefully have more objectives related to equity and environmental justice, and we report annually on this progress. And we also want to assess where we haven't been investing funding and put some concerted effort into funding some of these underfunded areas or groups. And last but not least, we know the importance of evaluating the impacts of our grant programs on forwarding equity. So looking back on what we've done and seeing if it's actually impactful. And after after these 6 themes in our JEDI guidelines, we have a glossary of terms for some of the words that we use throughout the guidelines.
Great.
Back to Amy.
Yes. Also attached to the JEDI guidelines is an appendix that summarizes actions. So again, the guidelines are meant as an umbrella for all of our work. The appendix is broken down by the topics that Linda just described that are in the guidelines, and talk about the ongoing actions, or things we have already implemented and are continuing to implement, as well as potential future actions the Conservancy could take. I'm just going to summarize some of those actions from the appendix, but I really encourage you to look at the appendix. We want this appendix to be a living document and be responsive to input and revise it based on the outcomes and whether what we are doing is actually impacting equity. So some of the ongoing actions, we have our Explore the Coast grant program that Linda mentioned. That has been going on for many years. It's an annual grant program to provide funding to enhance people's experiences accessing the coast of California. This past year, we established an external advisory board for Explore the Coast grants. So really an effort to share decision-making power in our grant programs. We have criteria in many of our grant programs that evaluate and give points for projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. And I do just want to say the use of the term disadvantaged communities here is because of the language in many of these funding measures, and it's a specific legal definition. I think our preferred, we definitely heard through the focus groups and online surveys about the importance of terminology and that this was not a preferred term. We set up a pre-application process for grants. So instead of potential grant recipients having to write a lengthy grant application, there is now a fairly simple pre-application. We have been doing a webinar series on equity-related issues, and thanks to all of the presenters who have been part of that webinar series. We developed a tips for community engagement guide for grantees and for our own staff, and that is available on our website. We have adopted a tribal consultation policy. We conduct tribal consultations with the projects we are funding, and we also have established tribal liaisons in each of our 4 regions. We are conducting implicit bias training for all of our staff. We established an internship program and also made some changes to our hiring classifications to improve our recruitment and hiring efforts. And as mentioned, we do have 3 existing metrics for environmental justice objectives in our current strategic plan. So some of our proposed actions, we want to analyze where the Conservancy has invested funds. So the types of organizations, the geographies, the project types. We have much of this information, obviously, and want to really analyze it. And then engage organizations in areas identified as underfunded by the Conservancy. We plan to continue revising our grant application scoring criteria. So that could address such things as meaningful community engagement, receiving more points or a better evaluation, the benefits to frontline communities, continuing to include that, and then also conducting a workshop on barriers to applying for and managing Conservancy grants. So I also just want to say that these JEDI guidelines, this is not going to be a one and done sort of document. We recognize that this is ongoing work, and with many of the things in the JEDI guidelines, we want to follow up and collect more input through workshops and other efforts. We want to listen to people and make revisions to the work we're doing. Expanding the technical assistance our staff provides before and after grant rounds. Pursuing opportunities to advance funds. Right now, our grants are funded in arrears, which can be very challenging for small organizations. Seeking solutions to the state contracting issues related to the sovereign immunity of tribes. Assisting tribes in regaining access to ancestral coastal lands and in managing those lands. Conducting internal staff workshops on cultural humility, community engagement, and other topics. And undergoing an equity impact review of our work, similar to an environmental impact review, but focused on equity. So I just wanted to also share some quotes that came out of our online survey. We asked for people's visions for an equitable coast, and there were many visions. It was really inspiring to read, and these were 3 that we pulled out that get at much of what we are trying to accomplish through our JEDI guidelines and through our work. The access to the coast, sharing power in terms of decision making on our work, and allowing and encouraging others to play leadership roles in a restorative vision. I'm just leaving that up so you can read the quote. Okay, Taylor.
Sure. So yeah, that was the discussion of the guidelines, or our presentation of them. And as Amy mentioned, we are now in the public comment period. We would love feedback, comments, thoughts, ideas between now and March 13th. And there are lots and lots of ways to do this. Email, snail mail, we have an online form, you can call us, and we will also be logging the comments that people make in this webinar. So if you just want to type your comment, your thoughts into the question box, those will all be logged and taken into consideration as we revise the guidelines going forward. We are also having a public workshop on the guidelines at our board meeting, which is coming up next week in Oxnard, which everyone is welcome to. We'll be doing breakout groups and really talking through the guidelines with our staff, with our board members. So I encourage, if any of you are available and interested, to come. The details for the meeting are on our website, or if you have any questions, please reach out to us and we can provide more information on the specifics of that meeting. So after we've completed the public comment period on March 13th, then we'll be incorporating your comments, your feedback into the guidelines, and then presenting those back to our board either on April 2nd in the Bay Area or June 18th in Sacramento, which are our next two scheduled board meetings, depending on kind of the level of feedback and revision that we think is needed to incorporate all of the good input that we get from here. So once the board adopts these guidelines, and I hope we've clarified that the guidelines really are kind of setting the theme of our work, but the actual implementation of the work will be very flexible and responsive to feedback. So we will continue to kind of course correct and change and refocus our energies as we put this all into play. And we'll also continue to do more workshops and more webinars on specific actions talked about in the action plan, like barriers to applying for grants, and things like that throughout this year and beyond, because we really want to continue to refine this work as we go. So that is the end of our presentation. These are some of the ways that you can send us feedback. And now we are going to turn to the questions that are coming in on the question box through the webinar. So please do, if you have questions or concerns, put them in there, and we will talk about them now. The first one I see is from Hannah Doris. Where are the tips for community engagement located on your website? And that's in the grants tab. There's a drop-down called Resources for Current Grantees, and it's just one of the documents listed in there.
And then the next question is, how and with whom are you doing the equity impact review? And that has not yet been determined. But we recognize that that is a significant task. Okay, so the next question is, I'm wondering if either the materials from the guideline process, e.g. focus group and survey information, will be made publicly available, and or if there may be funding opportunities in the future to better understand these inequities, or if they will continue to be focused more on built infrastructure. So in terms of number one, the materials from the focus groups and the survey information are up on the website. The website on this page, that Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion site, if you scroll to the bottom, it has all the documents in one place, and it's the draft JEDI guidelines, the glossary of terms, the appendix, and the focus group summaries, and a lengthy, I would say the survey response is a fairly lengthy document, but it's got lots of great stuff in it. The focus group reports are amazing to read, so I really encourage you to look at those. So the second part of that question, funding opportunities in the future to better understand these inequities, or if they will continue to be focused more on built infrastructure. That's a very good question. I would say the Conservancy, we are a project-based agency. We receive, most of our funding is bond funding, which is focused on capital projects, built infrastructure. We do have our Explore the Coast grant program, which is not bond funded, so we are able to use that for community access projects. But I think we do want to better understand the inequities on the coast, and how in our role as a state agency focused on providing public access to the coast and on restoring the coast and its natural resources, we do want to understand the inequities around that work and how we can change our work to increase equity. Okay, there's a thank you. We like that. And then Hannah put up the tip, the community engagement tips. I'm not sure that you all see the questions that are coming in. Yeah, this is a problem with GoToWebinar, but I think we will make sure that the link to the community engagement tips is made available to everybody who's participating in this webinar. So I'm sure everybody is furiously typing questions. Okay. After assessing how the Conservancy-funded projects have either improved or worsened equity along the coast, do you have a plan to respond to the disparities or lack thereof? That is what that is the crux of this work, is assessing how we have either contributed to or not contributed to equity on the coast, and then taking action. And I think the plan is going to be based on the result of the assessment, but to the extent feasible, we want to continue to revise our grant programs and how it is we go about advertising our grant programs, how we provide technical assistance to organizations and communities, the barriers to applying for and managing Conservancy funding, and really do very meaningful and targeted outreach and engagement with communities that have not benefited from Conservancy funding for access and coastal restoration. Okay. Couple of things. Of this process so far, what areas were low-hanging fruit and what areas have been more challenging for the Conservancy staff and/or board, and how did you respond accordingly to those challenges? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. I think some of the low-hanging fruit has been around the criteria for our grant giving, around the details of our Explore the Coast grant program, setting up the Explore the Coast Advisory Board. These all took significant work, but I think they were obviously doable because we've done them. Did you have another example, Linda?
I was just going to say those seems like clear things that we could and should do.
Yeah. I think also some of the internal work that we're doing has been more of the low-hanging fruit.
Hiring criteria.
Yeah, our hiring work, the job classifications we're using, the way we set up hiring panels and interview questions, and then the staff, the opportunities for staff to participate in workshops and trainings around these topics. I think the more challenging work for the staff and board, I mean, this is ultimately about power and decision making and money, and that is and it's a challenging area. How do we share decision making power? How do we more equitably distribute grant funding? And I think that engagement piece is also challenging. California is a very large state, a lot of people, and how do we engage people, really listen, and be responsive. Okay, what is current range of funding to community organizations, and is it sufficient to support new workforce development approaches? So our current funding ranges for our Explore the Coast grants, those are grants of up to $50,000. That's our non-bond funding. Our bond-funded projects really range, but that can be, millions of dollars for projects. So within those grants, I think there is the opportunity to support workforce development as well as community engagement in terms of designing projects. And it's really us incentivizing that type of work in the review of grant applications and in working with grantees on their work programs for specific grants.
Right. Any other questions? Get them in now, because we're at the end of what we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
And as we said, any comments that you have, if now is not the time, we're happy to take your feedback offline to have discussions on an ongoing basis. So please do stay in touch.
Yeah. So another question is, will you do matchmaking to help community groups find other folks to work with? I think that's a very good idea and could be part of technical assistance. We are a state agency, and no matter how hard we try, it can be challenging to manage state grant funding. And if we can connect community-based organizations with, fiscal sponsors or others, that would be a great outcome of our technical assistance work. Okay, so somebody asked, when do you anticipate these principles and strategy being applied to grant applications? I think we're already incorporating some of it, but it's, I think it's going to continue to grow. We're hoping the JEDI guidelines will be adopted in April or June. We will then be holding various workshops on topics, and it's going to be an ongoing process. I don't think it's going to be the sort of thing where we totally revamp our grant programs and then, voila, we're done. It's the sort of thing where we need to test different strategies and adaptively manage. Okay, let's see. Oh, good. We are happy to help matchmake here in San Mateo County. Okay, I was like, is that the Santa Monica Mountains? No, it's San Mateo County. Great, thank you. From your feedback from focus groups, what size of organizations did people consider already quite large and well off?
I mean, the ones that, this is Taylor, the ones I attended, we didn't name too many names, but I think, you know, the biggies that come to mind, the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land and things, you know, these are well organized, established organizations. So I don't think there was a criteria, and I don't think anybody was too specific, but, you know, I think those are the level and the size of organization that people were thinking of.
Yeah, I think we recognize that smaller nonprofits, community-based organizations, it can be very challenging to apply for and manage state funding. And will future grants allow for advance payments for smaller community-based organizations, building their capacity to implement larger projects in their own communities is crucial? Yes, we definitely agree with that that second statement, and we are looking into advance payments. Obviously, you know, well, we don't get to make that decision all on our own, but we have staff, including our lawyers, working on this issue now. Sorry, I'm just looking at what is the criteria you will use to prioritize under-resourced and marginalized communities? I think that's a very good question, and something we have definitely struggled with. We do have a definition of what we mean by that in the JEDI criteria, but I would not say it's you know, a legal definition. So, you know, communities who have been historically and are still systematically excluded from political and policy-making processes, communities with low income or low levels of educational attainment, communities of color, LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, immigrants, tribes. That, you know, that's what our definition talks to. The funding we receive, much of it is focused on disadvantaged communities in California, which is based on income, average income in communities, in census tracts. You know, that's one tool we can use. There's also CalEnviroscreen, which layers in environmental impacts along with the income and other you know, data factors, but I don't think, I think we want to try to be flexible within these because we recognize, like, if you have one very strict definition, you could be really overlooking some communities. Okay, I see the 3 EJ objectives in your strategic plan and see the numerical references of current work, but I was wondering if you have quantitative or qualitative progress metrics outlined somewhere for both internal organization and external progress on those EJ objectives. At this point, the quantitative progress metrics are really around those 3 EJ objectives in the strategic plan, which is percent of our funding going towards disadvantaged communities. And to date, so in the first 2 years of this strategic plan, 36% of our funding has gone towards projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. The second is increasing climate change resilience in communities that lack capacity due to systemic inequities. And to date, we have funded 17 of those types of projects. And then increasing coastal access for Californians. And through our Explore the Coast grant program, that's how we've really been accomplishing that objective. But yeah, I think as part of the accountability work in the JEDI guidelines, we do need to develop quantitative or qualitative metrics for these program areas within the JEDI guidelines and track them. And I think in our next strategic plan update, more will be incorporated into the actual strategic plan than these 3 existing objectives. But I'm very glad someone's looking at the strategic plan. Okay.
Hey, another Taylor. So I think if there are no more, it doesn't look like there are more questions coming in. But do, as we said, continue, you know, if a thought strikes you at any time between now and ideally March 13th, please do let us know. We're here to learn and discuss and improve these guidelines and work to putting them into place. So
great. Any final thoughts, Linda?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. We really appreciate everyone's participation in this.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
and
you.
We'll be posting the recording of the webinar on our website and put some resources. Well, continue to look at the environmental justice and equity section on our website to find all the resources that we mentioned. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.